Alrighty, welcome leads. I love the conversation going on in the chat. I feel like it was somewhat targeted to me because I made the playlist for today. So Jenna, we're going to have a little heart-to-heart with one another. Just like Natasha, I mean, I think that when I hear this song, yes, it gets stuck in your head, but definitely brings a smile to your face. Brings you back to some good years with just like such a happy pop song. So anyway, today we have a fabulous presentation and professional development for you all. And so with that, we have our lead updates, and we asked that you all provide your updates for your sites in the agenda so that you can all see what's going on at other sites. I did look through it, and one thing that I loved seeing was teamwork and support. That so many of you guys are reporting out that your teams are coming together and that you're feeling very well supported amongst one another. So that was really just pleasant to read through. And with that, we're going to do district updates, and then we'll get into our professional development. I'll hand it over to Ms. Natasha Martinez.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you, Sarah, for including mbop despite Jenna's objections. Fun fact, so my dad loves to add in phrases that aren't actually in songs, but sound like they're in songs. So he swears that chili dog is in mbop, and like every time I hear it, all I hear is chili dog. So I'll let you sing it to yourself, and then it'll get stuck in your head. You're welcome. Okay, we're going to start with everyone's favorite thing, monitoring, ADE visit. Dr. Rostenberg asked for us to present on this at the last school psychologist meeting, and I've been putting it off because it's like the last thing I want to think about, but we probably should, because as most of you know, at least those of you that are enmeshed in the SPED world, this is cycle year 4 for our district, and that means that we have Arizona Department of Education coming physically to do on-site monitoring, and it's a lot more in-depth than any other cycle year. So you'll see the cycle years on this little graphic in front of you, and it kind of has check marks for all of the things that should be expected. But we'll transition to the next slide, and I will just kind of run you through exactly what we can expect. We're not going to go into explicit detail right now, but we will in subsequent meetings. And so really what it's going to look like this year is ADE has decided they are coming on March 6th. I think it's the week before spring break. Thank you. And they're going to be here for the entire week. And we are going to select a team. The PEA will select this team. We're really close to identifying all of the team members. If you've been nominated, then you'll be notified in the next couple of weeks here. And that team will do monitoring alongside ADE. So they will be pulling a sample of student files. They haven't given us an exact number yet, but it's determined by the population of kiddos that you have. And so it's looking like they're going to choose about 40 of our files. And then they're going to go through and they're going to do technical assistance like they do every year and tell us what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. And then at the very end, there's going to be a summary of findings. They're also going to be looking at things like policies and procedures to see how well our district, our governing board policies, and our procedures that we have outlined in our special ed handbook align to state and federal legislation. And then they're also going to be really looking deeply into our child find processes as well. And they're going to go above and beyond what they do in a typical year. We'll transition to the next slide. They're also going to be observing classrooms. This is general ed and special education classrooms, and they're really looking for evidence of research and evidence-based practices being utilized in the classrooms. They're also going to be looking at specific indicator data. They do that every year. The difference is this year, for example, during our Child Find Indicator 11, they are going to be looking at our 45-day screeners. Usually they will allow us to self-select and pull screeners and give them a sample size, but this year they're going to be physically going to our school sites and pulling them from CUME files, which is why we've done a lot of preparation with our principals and our site-based teams on developing action plans to improve their compliance with those 45-day screeners. They're also going to be looking at initial evaluations the same way that they do every year, and then our preschool transition practices in alignment with AZIP, with Arizona Early Intervention Program. And then at the end, they're going to generate a summary of findings, and those findings are going to tell us if we are going to go into corrective action, which I'd like to just burst our bubble right now, right here and now. We will likely go into corrective action. It is their responsibility to find something with districts, and I want to say they said the last update was 94% of districts that are in cycle year 4 typically end in corrective action. So it's a really high likelihood that we will, and that's okay, because the goal is the practices and the timeline that it takes for us to get out of corrective action is what districts typically find challenging, but we're in a really good position here. The one thing that is different this year than in any other year, other than them being on site and physically pulling things themselves, is we, as a part of our responsibility, have to choose an outcome focus area, which is what they call it. And that is something like least restrictive environment, student achievement, suspensions, expulsions, transitions. There's a number of things that we could choose. And depending on our data and what we view as most important, the selection that we made as a district was least restrictive environment. And so the two procedures that we have in district that help us to make both ethical database decisions and ensure that we're staying also within the state's guidelines are our change in LRE and location of placement procedure. And on the next slide, you'll see the interim placement, but we'll just talk a bit about each for just a moment, because with every year, there are areas where we do really well and some where we need to improve. And in the past couple of years, we've seen teams do a wonderful job with the change in LRE process. We've seen more complete data sets being shared. We've seen more alignment to the process. But this year, what we've noticed is there is some confusion with regard to the circumstances when we expedite those changes, and then also with when they're utilized, when changes are made because of caseload management. So we spoke a bit to Sykes about this, and I just want to share this with all of you because I'm sure that you fielded some questions or concerns from your team with regard to those two things. And I also want to reiterate, it's really critical that before you even consider change in least restrictive environment or location of placement for your kiddos, that you guys make sure that your teams have exhausted all of the options and resources that are available at your school site. Because if you haven't, then that is going to be the response when you initiate that action. The other thing that's really important to consider is right now, this process is only used when a student is in a less restrictive environment and the team is requesting for the student to be placed in a more restrictive environment. It is not used for the opposite. So we don't utilize this process when we're reducing levels of service, but the same process doesn't need to be used formally, but the steps in the process should be considered and utilized when going to a less restrictive environment, just because we've seen some inappropriate decisions. And really the purpose for this process is to make sure that we are looking at data and making data-based decisions and to reduce the instability for our kids, right? We want to make sure that our students are stable in their placements and that their placements are appropriate to meet their needs. We don't want a lot of movement for our kids. And so we've come across this year already a couple of situations where teams made premature decisions to move a student to a less restrictive setting, and now it's not working out for the kiddo, maybe because there's a change in circumstances for staff or a variety of other things, but now the team is considering moving the student back to a more restrictive placement, and that could have all been prevented if the team would have considered all of the data necessary before making that decision, rather than just looking at the circumstances at play initially and saying, yeah, I think this will work this year. So the two circumstances that are exceptions are a request to expedite. We only really look at those requests when there's some form of safety that's compromised for the particular student or for other students. And that generally happens when there's a medical issue or a behavioral issue. And so what we ask for you guys to do is when that request for to consider expediting a change occurs, that it go through Dr. Rostenberg during that consultation period that your psychologist has with her in terms of those initial steps. The other consideration is caseload management. As you guys know, there is a staffing issue that exists this year. We have less paraprofessionals in a classroom. We started off this year with really high numbers in our kindergarten through second grade programs, all programs that house kinder through second grade students. And that's a number of reasons, but it's has a lot to do with the effect of COVID on our kids, right? So we're seeing kiddos that are qualifying at higher rates, kiddos that have more severe needs than we did before. And so we're having to shift caseloads, and we're not following this change in least restrictive environment process because this process was created for teams to follow. Any change in student placement, we manage caseloads to make sure that teachers are not overburdened and that they're able to provide appropriate services. And so there will be times where we have to make a change based on caseloads, and we will not be following this process. And so if that happens, we will do our best to communicate with teams and prepare teams to receive students. But we want all of you to know that this process will not be followed in circumstances of caseload management. All right, the next is interim placement. And that is where we have a kiddo that comes into a school site, registers at their home school, and their needs can't be met at that home school, maybe because they don't house the program that's necessary for that student. The same applies with a request to expedite, as we just discussed, but the one thing that we're noticing is the propensity of parents to request to keep their child home until a permanent placement is decided is pretty frequent these days. And I understand as a mom myself for the need for consistency for my kids. I would want that also. However, that is where you all step in explaining to parents the need for their child to attend so that we can determine, is the IEP appropriate, right? Does this child really need the placement that's indicated in the IEP? Maybe they needed that in the former district, but they may not need that level of support here. And also, what does that program look like? We need to see what those needs are, and sometimes they're not in alignment with what the IEP indicates. So it's important for us to observe the student and ensure that the IEP that we're receiving is accurate so that we can best place the student to promote that stability for the student. The next two slides that I want you guys to take a look at relate to data that we've pulled over the course of a few years, and this is what the state asks us. So this is indicator 5. The state wants to see 65% or above of our students in level A classrooms. That means students that are receiving resource services, the least amount of services in level A. They want to see that be representative of 65% or more of our population. For students in self-contained programs, they want it to be 14% or below of our total population. And then students that are privately placed, they want to see 2% or below of our kiddos. So on the next slide, you'll see our data. As you can see, since 2018, we have not met that 65% or above criteria. We were closest in 2019 prior to the pandemic. Same with level C self-contained settings. We are closer to that. We've remained at 16% for the past few years. This year is representative of what we're seeing currently. And level D, we were doing really well up until there was a change in legislation last year. If you guys recall, students that attend ASDB are now considered to be attend an ASDB campus are now considered to be institutionally placed, which means ASDB is responsible for their education. They're the LEA. So that's why you see that hike in numbers. We're not having like a record high in placing students at the ACEs or anything like that. It's just representative of now all of those students that were once considered Isaac students are now considered outside placed, which is where that hike comes from. And so not only are we tracking this data, but now ADE is tracking this data, and they are going to judge our performance and progress toward our outcome focus on this particular data. And so you're going to be seeing this a lot more in the coming months, because we're going to be tracking this data to ensure that we are improving and moving toward not only what is ethical for our students and what is best, and placing them in the least restrictive environment where they can benefit from their IEPs, but also more alignment to the state criteria. The next slide you'll see is a comparison from year to year with regard to the total number of requests that we're seeing come across for interim placement and change out in LRE. And in the red and yellow, you'll see the number of kiddos that are reducing from a level C placement, a self-contained placement, back into resource, or from a level D, private placement, back into an Isaac self-contained program. And so the blue is representative of the kids we're moving to a more restrictive placement. Red and yellow is representative of the kids that are then transitioning out of those placements to a less restrictive placement. Can someone please unmute and tell me what they see when they look at this data?
We are receiving more than we are exiting.
Thank you. Yeah, we are requesting for our students to be placed in more restrictive settings more often than we are supporting them in ways that they can transition out. At our psych meeting, it was really profound. I don't recall who said it, but they said they pretty much they go there to die, right? Like they don't exit. It's a place where they go and they never come back. So we're treating special education like a place, not like a service. Our kids are being referred to more restrictive settings, and we are either not supporting them in the ways they need to be supported by providing them with quality services in order to give them access to receive less, right, a lesser restrictive environment, or we have a mindset problem, right? So I'm not sure which it is, but we're going to be exploring that in the next few months in more depth, and we're going to be reviewing data more often in order to figure out which of the two it is. It might be a combination of both, but I wanted to put this in front of you guys because you're on the front line, right? You are a part of the teams that make these decisions. So it's really critical that you consider this data and what is best for students when you are making those requests. And we are always here to support you to figure out and problem solve what we can do in the student's current setting to prevent them from moving to a more restrictive placement. So more discussion on this later, but I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Elena to talk about modification to grading.
Thank you, Natasha. Appreciate that transition. And so it's that time of year again where it's all hands are on deck, right? And we're figuring out grading and what that grading criteria looks like. And just a few friendly reminders that we want to make sure that everyone understands that that grading verbiage that should be embedded. Modified grades may only be assigned if the IEP deems that it's necessary. And so on the report card, there can be modified grades can be identified on the report card or transcript as long as the student's special education status remains confidential. So for example, there could be an asterisk or a checkbox that just says modified grade. Anything within the comments, anything within the notes of the grades that allude to the student's special education status or that they're on an IEP should be stricken from that, should not be even put on there, considered. So, and when a student, we need to remember that when a student struggles to meet even that essential grade level standard at this point, that you need to be able to decide if that the student is no longer performing at grade level, at their grade level standard, they should receive that designation on their report card documenting that information. So that's why they are taking into consideration their modified curriculum and modifying their grade as based on that information. And so then what does it look like on IEP Pro? So that's that section that we have to be able to accommodate that information, that we're going to make modifications to that grading scale, assignments and or tests. So making sure that you put in the specific type, whether it's going to be a 1, 2, or but it's going to be the assignments as well as the testing, and then the location of where they're going to receive those modified grades, okay, to be able to help support that. Alrighty. And now I'm going to transition over to Miss Sarah Marsh.
Alrighty, I have the last of district updates with you. And I wanted to talk about IEP audits. So I wanted to share with you some of the data that I have from the IEPs that I have reviewed so far this year. And these are annual IEPs. And what I use is the Arizona Department of Ed audit form, and I have that in a Google Forms. And so each one is marked either in or out of compliance. And if it's out of compliance, I indicate which area is out of compliance. So of the 40 plus IEPs that I have reviewed, we have more than half of them that are noted as out of compliance. And that might just be one area. It might be a lot of different areas in the IEP. What I notice the most of are these three areas here. So teachers are struggling with writing measurable goals. The biggest one is the description of special education services to be provided. And I understand that, for teachers that have been here for a while, that there was a different understanding of what should go in that clarification box. So I want to be able to provide all of you leads so that you can support your teams with instruction and kind of training on looking at the specially designed instruction. And then lastly, the extent to which students are not going to participate with their peers. Those explanations are oftentimes lacking the why the student needs to be pulled out from the gen ed classroom. So with that said, I wanted to propose two training dates, and so if you could just take a moment to think about which day would work better for you. I'll be sending out an email following our training today, and just requesting that you indicate whether you would prefer doing Tuesday, October 18th, or Wednesday, the 19th, or if either of them would work for you. And that is all I have on to some learning.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, guys, we're going to transition from updates now into the primary content for our session this afternoon. We're going to dive right into the professional learning component. So thank you, by the way, Courtney and Jessica, for hanging in there with relation to all the special ed updates. We appreciate you guys. Okay, so I want to remind you guys, I know this is probably familiar to all of you already. You've seen it, heard it a few times, but want to remind you the work of John Hattie. For those of you that are 10-second toms like me and forget things so easily, we talked about it in lead orientation. We talked about it in student services orientation. But I want to remind you of the right implications of the research, right? So Hattie developed this. He utilized data to look at a number of meta-analyses and determine influences on student achievement, right? That 0.4 that you see on here is the critical point. It's the hinge point that he determined anything beyond that was really effective and significantly impacted student achievement. Anything to the left of it was less effective and all the way down to actually providing an adverse effect on student achievement. And so in our lead orientation, we focus specifically on collective teacher efficacy, which you see on the bottom right-hand side. And it had the single largest impact on student achievement of all those influences that he measured. But for the purpose of our professional learning sessions this school year, we are going to shift our focus to another influence that has a really significant effect size, and that's feedback. And so we'll transition to our next slide where you guys will see our WPI scores. The focus of our content last year was taking each of those leadership behaviors and we addressed them one by one, right? So we went really in depth into concern for others. We went to leadership orientation, but this year we've decided we're going to shift our focus for a number of reasons, but primarily because our reality doesn't work like that, right? We can't compartmentalize incidents or issues or events. We can't address them in isolation. And so a huge part of being leaders at your sites and within your departments entails that ability to zoom in and zoom out that we talked about, zooming out and looking at the bigger picture And that requires you to utilize a lot of different skills in tandem, multiple skills. And so when we focus on those skills in isolation, or a term that you're going to hear a lot here in Isaac, in silos, we're missing some great opportunities to exercise multiple leadership behaviors at one time, which is why we decided to shift our approach this year and focus on one huge topic that's going to enhance all of our skills and the areas that we identified as needing some growth in this year. And so we're going to focus really on depth in feedback, and it's going to help us improve all of these things, right? It helps us improve achievement and leadership orientation. It's going to continue our work on concern for others. We did some really great work around that last year, and we saw a shift in our individual scores and our collective scores. And it's also going to collectively boost our ability to innovate and take initiative. And so I most importantly, the result of the feedback work we're going to do is going to provide your peers, your teammates, the opportunity to improve on their practice. It's going to promote more reflection, more clarity, more credibility. All of those things are going to help build collective teacher efficacy at your school sites, within your teams, within your departments. So before we move on, quiz time. Who's going to earn a gold star and tell me, without Googling it, I'm watching you guys, what is collective teacher efficacy? First person to enter it in the chat gets a gold star. Enter it in the chat. Don't Google it. I'm watching you. Boom. I knew it was going to, somehow I knew it was going to be Courtney. Yes. It is the belief or the ability that you can positively affect students, right? That you can positively affect student achievement at your sites. So we'll transition to the next slide. It has the highest effect size. It's a 1.57. And through our work, through feedback, our main hope is to affect this at your schools. And that means a number of things. And so to share the ways that this work that we're going to engage in ties within your role as leads and the goals that we hope to accomplish collectively as a department, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Elena Estrada.
Alrighty. So as we're talking about the content today, we know that we're all working as leaders towards our departmental goals, and as we're doing that within our individual roles. So the content area that we're learning today is we'll be able to add additional tools to our toolbox to help support the feedback and the 4 C's. So when you are learning the content, we want you to consider, how are we going to use these tools in our roles to be able to connect the department goals with the 4 C's: collaboration, communication, climate and culture, and compliance? And how do we support our peers within our departments in these 4 areas in accomplishing our department goals? So those are going to be 2 things we would like you to be able to consider. So now I'm going to turn it over to Miss Sarah.
Thank you. Alrighty, so getting into our learning intentions today, we have 4 different learning intentions that we want you all to walk away with to have a better understanding of how research supports the impact of feedback. We already started talking about the research, the work of John Hattie, and we're going to look a little bit more into that. Along with that, we want you to understand the different components, elements of providing effective feedback, and then learn the importance of balancing empathy and candor when providing feedback. That can be a challenging thing to do. So we want you guys to feel strengthened in your ability to balance empathy and candor. And then we want you to understand how to deliver neutral feedback. So lots to come. First, we're going to go into a little activity, small group discussion, and some reading. So the title of an article we have for you is 7 Keys to Effective Feedback. And we will post the link to the PDF in the chat. You can also find it on your calendar invite, and it's also in the agenda. So whichever way is easiest for you to access that document. If you could take a moment to open it up, that would be fabulous. Alrighty, and then I'll go through the instructions and we'll get into our breakout groups. So you'll be divided into groups of 3. There's going to be one group of just 2 of you. Each of us from the Student Services Department will be in one of the groups with you to just kind of move conversation along. But what we really want you to do is engage in conversation about what you learned from the sections you read and your thoughts about the article. So you'll have 15 minutes to do a jigsaw read. So once you're in your groups, assign sections for each participant to read independently. And I combine them in sections 1, 2, and then someone can take sections 3, 4, and then someone can take 5, 6, and 7. 5, 6, and 7 are not necessarily longer. They're smaller sections, so pair them together. I want everyone to read the introduction because each section will refer back to the introduction, some of the examples that the author had used. And then once everyone is done reading, come together and share out the takeaways. So you be the teacher of your section and share the highlights of what you learned to the component of effective feedback that you read about. And then along with that, and as you read through and as you listen to your colleagues, think about what you perceive to be your personal strength. Any questions before we go into breakout groups? Alrighty, Jeremy, we can give it a go. Alrighty, welcome back. I was bopping around from breakout room to breakout room, and it sounded like a handful of you were kind of getting through the tail end of the of kind of sharing out what you had read. So I would encourage you to print this document out. I did and highlighted it a bunch. It's just really useful to think about my role, the feedback that I'm providing to others, and some of those things about like, what do I do well? What are areas that I could work on? So fabulous article. I hope that you guys all enjoyed it. And let's hand it over to Natasha for just a moment of reflection.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you guys so much for thinking through all of that. I heard a lot of reflection on how that affects you within your role and how you've done in that particular area based upon the keys that you were talking about. But I know it's hard when you have an article like that and you're kind of talking through it to process it all at one time. So I want to give you guys just a moment of quiet reflection on what you just learned in relation to your own experiences. And so I want you to reflect upon the statement you see in front of you. Think about a time in your life when you received feedback that helped you grow personally and professionally. And now that you've kind of read through that and you have a better understanding of what feedback is and what it is not, that'll help you to craft kind of your thought process. And as you're thinking through that, I want you to also consider, what was the relationship of the person that provided the feedback to you? And what was it about the feedback that made it feel helpful or supportive to you? Okay, so just think a little bit about that, take a quiet moment, and I'm going to be selecting volunteers in just a moment. All right, guys, would anybody like to volunteer to share that feedback and a bit about who delivered that feedback to you and how you found it supportive? Any volunteers? If you would like to volunteer, just unmute your mic and share.
I'll start. All right. So I'm just thinking of when I used to be a graduate student and I had a supervisor, I received a lot of feedback at that point. And what I found really helpful, first of all, as we read these points, it feels like my supervisor certainly carried a lot of those different feedback styles consistently. But I think what was most important is that there was a sense of respect and trust. And I saw this person as an expert in understanding the kind of feedback that was being given. So it was taken much, much better than if it would have just been somebody that I felt like maybe didn't have that knowledge base and it was more like opinions instead of true feedback to help me grow.
Thank you. Awesome, Dahlia. Yeah, credibility is huge, right? And so is feeling like you can trust the person that's giving you the feedback. Thank you so much for sharing that experience. Would anybody else like to share before we move on?
I can. I don't mind. I look back on being at Isaac because I came from my school for the deaf bubble. And initially principals were doing my observations. And it didn't help me because every time I had an observation, I left feeling frustrated because they didn't get me. And then finally, somebody in the SPED department did my observation. And to this day, I still hear that feedback that was neutral and safe, but directly impacted who I am as a teacher and how I teach and how I plan when I'm thinking about teaching, because I still have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary in my brain. And every time I go through an article, I think back, like 6 years ago and how it truly impacted me as a teacher.
Thanks for sharing, Terry. You're the best. I think we'll move on after that because I'm going to cry. So yeah, thank you guys so much for sharing. And I kind of heard a lot of themes with you. It's somebody that you trusted. It's somebody that you found credible. I think I heard neutral, which was something you heard in the keys, right? What I didn't hear was any of this, right? I didn't hear somebody was trying to fix you. I didn't hear that. I didn't even hear really praise, which is really a common misconception for what feedback is. I didn't hear that this person was delivering their opinion to you. And so what I want you to look at and think about when you see these statements is these are really common misconceptions that are actually false. These are not forms of feedback, but they're commonly viewed as forms of feedback. And so what we'll see is when people step into a position of leadership for the first time, like all of you, and they think of providing feedback to peers, these are things that they commonly go to, right? This praise, their opinion, constructive criticism is my personal favorite term that people misconstrue for feedback. And so I want you to erase those from your mind because those are not feedback forms that we're going to be talking about today. And so we will transition on to what we will be talking about, which is these 4 things. And in consideration of time today, we're not going to get through all 4, but we are going to talk about the first 2. And so these are steps, and these concepts that are listed in these steps outline the work that was done by some researchers at a relatively unknown college called Harvard. And so in this session, we're going to be talking about, in this session and subsequent sessions, we're going to be talking about all of them. And I'd like to start with empathy and candor, and then we'll transition into neutrality, which you heard a little bit about in those 7 keys. And so we'll begin by discussing this concept of empathy and candor, but before we do, we have to know what that means. So I'm going to do another pop quiz for a gold star, since I know you guys love that so much. And I'd like for you guys to not Google it, because I'm staring at all of you and I can tell when you're Googling. What does empathy mean and what does candor mean? And I want the Merriam-Webster definition of both of those. First person to put it in the chat. gets a gold star. And go. Jenna. Perfect. Empathy, showing concern for another person, being able to put yourself into their shoes. Okay. Rapport, candor, kinda. Anybody else want to take a shot at candor? Let me try a variation of candor. Candid. Candid. If you're candid in a conversation, thank you. Direct. Very good. All right. Thank you. We can advance on. Great job. So empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, being able to put yourself in their shoes and experience or understand the emotions that they're feeling. And then candor is really being frank, being direct, being honest. Personally, I think candor is one of my strongest skills. I think aggression is also a strong skill. No, just kidding. That I have. But these two definitions are important for you to understand because I want to talk to you a bit about a framework that was super helpful for me. I actually read this book last year and it was kind of groundbreaking for me. And so I'd like to share this framework with you all because it's super critical. It is all about a balanced approach to those two things, right? Empathy and candor. It came from this Chickie Poo, Kim Scott. She wrote this book, Radical Candor. It's a great read. If you do professional reading, I highly recommend it. It's an easy read. It's not like a wine, or it's not like a coffee read. It's like you could read it with wine and you'd be fine. She's a former Apple and Google employee, and she developed the framework from office drama, which I thought was pretty funny. Her idea, her like main premise of this is that feedback is most effective when it's delivered with this balanced approach of caring for someone personally while challenging them directly. So caring for them personally is that empathy, and then challenging them directly is that candor, right? It takes an effort to get that balance right, and she calls it the state of radical candor. And so if it's unbalanced, any number of things can happen. But that radical candor breaks down to two things. It's caring personally, or what I like to call, as if you would transition over, giving a damn, right? And challenging directly, which is having or being willing to piss people off, because that's typically what happens when you're direct, right? And if you lack one or both of these in the way that you approach providing feedback, something is going to go wrong. And you're going to fall into one of those other three dimensions on the framework. So we'll advance so you can see what those dimensions are. And I will kind of go through each one of them. And so if you criticize someone and you show, that you don't really care about them, your feedback is going to fall into that bottom right-hand category of obnoxiously aggressive to the person that's receiving it, right? When that happens, people shut down when they feel like you're aggressive. Their defenses, their walls come up, they become defensive. They have that amygdala hijack, right? And it doesn't matter how well you intend for your message to be received. Your feedback is really useless because it's not being heard. Now, if you go to the complete opposite and you look at this term of empathy, right, over here, this is even worse, right? And so we'll transition to the next slide where there's a quote that I like. This is where people are too afraid to provide direct feedback to someone because they're afraid of how it's going to be received. And so Kim Scott says, patronizing or insincere praise will erode trust and relationship just as much as harsh criticism does. This ruinous empathy it's just as bad as that obnoxious aggression that we talked about. And she said it's even worse just because in that obnoxious aggression, you are at least willing to convey the critical feedback, even though you don't have that foundation of caring. But in this ruinous empathy, you're sweeping it under the rug completely. So you're not even acknowledging it. And the problem with that is feedback is really critical to a person's growth. If you're not willing to give quality feedback openly, even the risk of creating tension or discomfort to that person, right? You're not being helpful. And that is our job as a leader, is to be helpful to one another and to our team as a whole. And you're not helpful if you're letting poor performance or poor behavior slide, right? That sends a huge message too. And I know you all have experienced leaders that do that. And it's not only frustrating for you, but it's frustrating for the entire team to be the recipient of additional work because the supervisor or the leader is allowing poor performance or poor feedback to slide. And so we'll go to the next slide. The next one is this manipulative insincerity. It's on the bottom left-hand side. It creates mistrust. These are people who are, these are leaders, should I say, people in general who are obsessed with being liked, right? They like to please others. They like to maintain the loyalty of others, and they wouldn't dare risk disrupting any of that by sharing the truth. I personally think this one is the worst because these are the weenies, right? People give praise or criticism in order to take advantage at times, or as a lot of people call it, because they like to be fake, just because they don't want to be disliked. But that is similar to that, the one above it, where you are you're not being honest and you're allowing things to slide because you have a fear of creating discomfort and not being liked. And so that radical candor is really what we're shooting for. It's that balance. And so if you don't have those two criteria that are necessary, right, that caring personally and that challenging directly, you're going to fall into one of these other areas. And so we'll transition to the next slide, which I think is really important. Kim said, to have good relationships, you have to care about others as human beings. It's not just business, it's personal. Caring about someone personally means you have to embrace everything about them, right? And you allow them to embrace things that occur in others. We have lives outside of work, and that's critical to who we are. And we can't just be robots in the workplace and ignore that. It's critical that you guys as leaders, that anyone as a leader, demonstrates a genuine care and concern for your peers, for those on your team. I heard those of you who shared say things like you trusted the person that was delivering the feedback, you identified that they had credibility, right? You knew that those people cared about you. And that's a component of why you received that feedback well. So we'll transition to the next slide. The second component is challenging them directly, that candor, right? It involves telling people in a caring way, in a non-judgmental way, when their work is falling short, right? In the 7 keys, we heard about that neutrality, and we're going to hear more about it later. But for a lot of leaders, they fear like the defensive or the angry reactions from their peers or from staff. And so that causes a lot of our leaders to avoid the truth, right? And people are hungry for the truth. And I love this quote from Kim Scott because it's true. It's so true, right? Great leaders get past that, right? It's always a source of nerves for anyone, especially a new leader, when you're delivering a direct message to somebody. A tough message is not easy to swallow, and we talked a lot about that last year. But when it comes to relationships that really endure, you can't fake it. If your feedback is in the best interest of people, they're going to know it. Even if hearing it kind of pinches, if you will, they still get your caring intent out of it. And so transitioning to the next slide, this was the easiest way for me to remember it. The 2 most important pieces are giving a damn and being willing to piss people off. And so I wanted to just show you another quick representation that helps me to better understand when something falls short. If so, you'll transition to the next slide. This one is a little easier for me to understand, so you can see in the matrix. If you are not challenging somebody directly and you don't care about them personally, you're going to be you are termed manipulatively insincere. That's a mouthful. But if you care about them personally and you challenge them directly, that's considered radical candor, right? If you are direct, but you don't care, you're obnoxiously aggressive. And so this framework is really critical for me because most of you who have known me for a period of time, I can be obnoxiously aggressive. I can fall in that category because I have the propensity to, and this is just me being honest, I have the propensity to worry so much about the kids and what we do and our effect on kids that I ignore that people are not robots, right? And I sometimes forget to present the fact that I genuinely care about our staff, about all of you. But those of you who have known me for a number of years, you know that I genuinely care. So when I bark, it's not received as being obnoxiously aggressive. But for any of us, veteran leaders or brand new leaders, it's really critical to consider that balance of empathy and candor in the way that we deliver feedback. Otherwise, we risk our message being lost. So if we'll transition to the next slide, I would like to share with you 2 strategies that we're going to delve more deeply into after Katie has had an opportunity to share about neutrality and feedback. But my supervisor shared with me long ago when I stepped into this role unwillingly that I will never lose by using 2 strategies: empathy statements and asking questions, right? You're never going to lose. You're never going to fail if you do those 2 things, no matter the circumstance. But the challenge that I've found, that all of you have, I'm sure, found, is having the situational awareness to know when to use one or the other. So we're just going to start briefly with empathy statements and consider, a time, which I'm sure you guys have all experienced, when you've been in a meeting and it's gone south, right? And I'm sure there's been a lot of times where you're not in the leadership seat, you don't really have to do anything about it, and you can just watch the drama go down, and that's always really fun. But now that you guys are in the leadership seat, it's your responsibility to do something about it. And you might need to stop that staff member from derailing that train even further. And so you might utilize one of these empathy statements by saying, I hear you, Jeremy. That really sounds challenging. I would like to talk through that a bit further after our meeting to see if we can't problem solve and come up with some solutions together. But we're going to stay on topic and continue with whatever the content is, right? Or you might have, and we'll go to the next one, or you might have a staff member who's maybe complaining about a new student that they received. And maybe that staff member, and there's some people that are smiling because they're experiencing this right now, yet maybe that staff member is resistant to the support that's being offered by a coach. And so in that situation, you might decide on a different approach, right? You might demonstrate your care for them personally by acknowledging the challenges they've shared and using one of those empathy statements. And it might sound like, I hear you, you're having a really challenging time meeting Johnny's needs. And then you might choose to ask a question to kind of advance that dialogue. And you utilize that questioning to lead them to the reflection that you want them to have about the situation or about their practice or about their behavior, right? So if this teacher's resistant to this feedback, I might say something like, what do you feel is holding you back at this moment? Maybe from implementing the feedback you've received from the coach, or just in general, what do you feel is holding you back at this moment? And it's always really critical to select the appropriate question to guide someone to what you want them to reflect upon. But the underlying skill of all of these tools that we're going to provide you is knowing when to employ them and how to employ them. And that starts with first intuition, which you guys all have, and then it develops with practice, right? Practice makes perfect. We're not looking for perfection, we're just looking for progress. But the more we practice, the better we get at these things. And so we're going to practice utilizing these empathy statements and the reflective questioning more in this session and also in subsequent sessions. And you're going to hear your lead representative in the one-to-ones that they have with you guys utilizing these as well to help coach you to coach your teams. But we are now going to take a moment and transition on to our final tool for the day, which is the second concept of staying neutral, this neutrality. and to guide us in exploring the common myths more surrounding feedback and that concept of neutrality, I'm going to turn it over to Katie Anderson.
Hello, everyone. So nice to see all of your faces and sharing an umbop with you to start out our session. So that was excellent. So it's vitally important that we begin to recognize really the difference, and if you could transition slides, between two main types of feedback within the school setting, and that's formative feedback, which is provided in chunks over time and often builds upon itself to produce summative feedback. The single most important distinction being that summative feedback is really evaluative in nature. So your role as a lead on your site and within your department is as a coach. So therefore, you provide formative feedback. You don't evaluate, nor do you provide summative feedback. So leave the summative feedback to your principals who get that opportunity to collect both formative and summative feedback. So the 4 C's are the framework through which you can organize aspects of your coaching role as either a site or departmental lead, and sometimes both. Thank you, Dr. Rostenberg. Feedback can enhance collaboration by building trust among your teammates, raising the rigor of how you interact with each other, with other staff members on campus, with students, and even their families. So feedback naturally opens the door to communication because it gets the conversation started and it can set the tone for all aspects of your interactions that are occurring within your school setting. So when we build upon that trust, establish and maintain credibility within our teams, and have the courage to use empathy and candor together in our coaching conversations, the climate and culture is naturally impacted as well. So finally, giving regular feedback to our teammates in the area of compliance improves outcomes in the area of compliance, but it also articulates the skills and services that they need in order to support student growth, as well as ensure success for our teams. So Grant Wiggins is an ambassador for education and has authored many works that contribute to improved student outcome across lots of areas. He also authored today's feature article in 7 Keys to Effective Feedback. You may remember reading his famous quote there. He said, "Feedback is information about how we are doing in our efforts to reach a goal. The key to his insight for me is information, fact-based, unbiased, unassuming information. Neutrality supports defining that information." So when thinking about feedback, many of us envision praise or criticism, even though we didn't really mention it in the examples earlier. That's likely a result of lots of factors which have played a role throughout our lives, like different leaders we've worked with, maybe our parenting styles that our parents used when we were younger. Neutrality is all about reserving judgment of facts that are being shared and instead offering that information. So the problem with praise and criticism is really we're perpetuating the good versus bad designation by being value-based. We're also perpetuating the "I need to impress my boss" mentality by being approval-based. Or even "I'm only as good as my boss sees me" by being affirmation-based. So when giving feedback with praise and criticism, or the sandwich effect, the giver holds ownership of learning and growth, not the recipient. And the feedback is based on the feedback giver's opinion, not on facts. So finally, praise and criticism are so often just really biased, and excellence looks different on different people and in different contexts. So the bottom line is praise is often perceived as insincere. Criticism is either vague and lacking information, or it's overly pointed and direct, which according to science triggers individuals' sympathetic nervous system and shuts down their creativity and growth, activating their fight or flight response. It's often misplaced. The recipient lacks awareness in the first place, but they're trying the task anyway. Feedback will compound the issue and even hinder their learning. So let's talk about shifting from criticism to feedback. When making the shift, really we move from a focus put upon what we don't want to what we do want, from an emphasis on focusing on the past, the future, from weakness to strength, from deflating our teammates to inspiring them, from saying, you are the problem, to we can make this better together. With so many of you with such high affinities for social orientation and concern for others, that's a shift that's easy to get behind. So when providing feedback, it can be helpful to replay small moments of excellence that you observe. This helps to build trust and credibility while also helping the recipient begin to see what excellent looks like and feels like, similar to how we tell our students that they're being good leaders or good helpers. And by labeling that, helping them to see what traits make up a good leader or a good classroom helper. So here we've got some ample examples of things we want you to avoid, because truly when we offer our opinion, we give empty praise or we use vague language, it causes a lot of challenges, right? So many of us use these statements and they perpetuate a mentality that just plain isn't helpful when providing feedback. So as I shared before, and so did the boss, by emphasizing being direct with your use of language and in giving feedback, you're able to establish and maintain credibility. It also indicates that you know what you're talking about and establishes trust with whoever is receiving that feedback. So let's begin with an example that would likely be delivered by your trusted and valued supervisor. You guys wouldn't be giving instructional feedback like this, but just put yourself in the position of the receiver of this feedback. Consider this would likely be in writing following a formal observation in a content area. So today, your students were engaged in independent practice as they completed math pages in their workbooks. I might think, wow, well, you were taking notes on your computer. You really weren't paying attention. Next thing, you were checking in with each student as they worked independently. I might think as an educator, man, as a matter of fact, I was. At this point, I'm fluffing my feathers, sitting a little bit taller, feeling proud, right? Then I hear a couple of questions. What did you notice as you listened in on their thinking? So during their independent work, I was walking around. I was listening to them share with one another what their thinking was. Now I'm thinking back to that lesson and I'm able to really put myself in the shoes of that moment and truly reflect on what were my students thinking and how were they explaining their thinking. Next question, how will this information drive your lesson planning for tomorrow? So now this leader is already getting me right back to that next level, getting me to consider how this might impact my practices for the very next day. So when we offer succinct, neutral feedback like this, paired with appropriate reflective questioning, we can guide people toward the direction that we want them to go without telling them what to do. So notice that in this example, there were no opinions used, just observations, and the questions were specifically designed to elicit a given outcome. So for this one, I'm going to ask for you to participate a little bit, so pay attention. After a weekly meeting with your team, you want to follow up with a team member whose behavior impacted the progress of the team within that meeting. It sounded like this. In our meeting, I observed you sitting with your arms and legs crossed. You passed on sharing your ups and downs for the week, and you sighed when we talked about updates to procedures. Using the reflective questioning PDF that we saw earlier, I want you to select what question you might ask, and I just put it in the chat for those of you that want to access it. It's also in the calendar invite and the agenda. What is a good question to follow up and maybe guide this discussion a little bit further? Go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can just unmute and tell me what question you would ask. All right. Can anybody unmute and tell me what question you might ask? I'll show it to you. Okay, thank you, Jenna. What support do you need from me to make the meeting more comprehensive to you? Okay. Are you okay? Remember, we're going to use the reflective questioning PDF that I popped into the chat. How do you feel about sharing your ups and downs for the week? Focus on getting them to share. Courtney.
I would ask, what is another way you might communicate your feelings in a way that doesn't hinder the progress of our group meeting?
What I really appreciate about the question that you chose to ask is that it was a direct question that immediately fielded the problem that you identified from the very short description that I provided, right? You have this individual during a meeting, they're crossing their arms, they're refusing to participate, they're making large sighs at a certain agenda item. Your question does a great job of capturing exactly where the problem lies and where a solution might be generated, whereas some of the other questions in the chat are a little bit vague and open still, and that's why we're practicing. So thank you to those of you that participated. Let's go on to the very next example. So following a training session, 3 staff members were observed talking in whisper voices, pointing at another staff member who was crying and stormed out of the room. In addition to approaching them with neutrality, you might probe them to begin reflecting on their behavior with reflective questioning, right? However, after addressing the 3, now you want to address the staff member who was being pointed at, who stormed out of the room, before selecting an empathy statement we might use. Let's first talk through this wording for this scenario, and how can we make it a little bit less opinionated? So here's how the example is. I want you guys to think about how you might correct what you say. I noticed some gossiping occurring after our professional learning session today. You were not participating, but you looked really upset by it. How might you approach that individual with a little bit more neutrality, right? The problematic language I find here is gossiping. You were not participating is still, that's an observation, but you looked really upset by it. How might we change that language just a little bit? I'm going to put somebody on the spot since you guys are taking your time. Let's see, who can I put on the spot? You know, I always put Carol on the spot. What about Terry?
I was already starting to type in the thing. Gossiping has such a negative connotation. I would change the word to something a little bit more neutral, like I noticed a conversation that was occurring.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Anybody else? Jenna, I see put in the chat. Let me see. I saw some conversations today you were troubled by. What happened? That feels pretty neutral to me. Again, you can always go back to your reflective questions to try and come up with a response. So after you, now that we've talked about kind of changing the language of how you might address that individual, I want you to refer to the empathy responses PDF and ask yourself, which of the empathy statements might you use when you're approaching the staff member? So rather than making an observation, maybe right away you start off with an empathy response. Can you guys go ahead and put in the chat what you might choose? We could also advance the slide so they can see it. How are you doing? might fall under showing that interest, right? Inviting them into the conversation. How are you doing? It's very vague. It's not assuming. It's not even capturing what just happened. See if they offer information about what just happened. Anything else? All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on. So the last thing I just want to say about empathetic responses is really, we want you to think through how to match the situation, right? The reason that you approached the 3 staff members that were doing the talking and pointing differently than the individual that was receiving, that needed more of an empathetic response is to match the situation. So again, like the boss said, you always have to consider with your intuition, how are you going to address that given problem? What is the best approach, and how might you utilize radical candor and neutrality in supporting their learning? So we hear you guys that you need more practice. So we're going to skip through this, but we just want to let you know that today was an opportunity for us to dip your toe into some strategies, and you can hit the ground running with those tomorrow. You will still have some chances to talk through these with your student services representative, and I know Elena's going to elaborate more on that in today's wrap-up. So for now, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Jeremy Gibson. Take out your smartphones. It's Mentimeter time, people.
All right. Thank you so much. And we really do appreciate all of your guys' time. And I know I'm standing between the next 3 minutes of you and 5 o'clock. However, we are going to keep you guys about 5 minutes over just because we think this is an important wrap-up. So if you guys can go ahead, I'll give you about 15 seconds to get the Mentimeter up, and then I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which is going to take that barcode away. So if you're using a phone, you can use the barcode, or if you are on your laptop, you can also use the URL that is there. So I'll give you guys 15 seconds to get loaded into there, and if you are, you can start answering the prompts. So the first question that we're going to answer is, how would you rate yourself on each of the 4 C's based on your performance as lead last year? So this is how you would rate yourself. All right, it seems like we got most of ours. Next is, how would your site or team members rate you as lead in each of the 4 C's? Compliance seems to be the highest. Culture and climate, communication. So it looks like communication and compliance are starting to dominate. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to open up for a quick discussion around just those few prompts. So how did the question about how your site/team members rate you as a lead make you feel? You can type it, you can unmute. But that question in particular, how did it make you feel? Awkward, unsure. We'll get one more response and then we'll move forward. It's not a typical question that we might reflect on. I know for me it wasn't. Just one more. Mostly unsure. Not sure how they actually feel. Feel like maybe I'm not meeting their expectations. If we go to the next slide, we're going to open it up a little bit more and just ask why it might be important to know your team views of your leadership style. And now I want you to shift your thinking into feedback, how you deliver feedback. whether it's feedback on compliance, feedback on collaboration, culture, climate, or just generally how you communicate your feedback now that you guys have a little bit more context. Why do you think it's important to know how your team views your leadership style and your feedback style? Really, so we can improve as a team. Help us to know how we can improve and be more effective leaders. Dr. Rosberg, thank you. And the final question, just to think through, as Courtney wraps up there saying, knowing how my team views my leadership style improves my individual empathetic response to each team member. And Terry also added growth as a team member and in leadership. And that's the whole point of looking at and reflecting on our leadership styles and opening that feedback up to our team. So we can go to the next slide here. I want you just to read this to yourself. We're not going to answer this one out loud because we're going to provide you a little bit of guidance on this. So what ways could you access direct feedback from your site/team members regarding your performance that is anonymous, informative, and supportive in your development as a lead? So if we go to the next slide, Elena. One thing that I want you guys to consider and start reflecting on, and all of us here in Student Services, as you get the presentation, is that particular question. How can we get that feedback? And how do we drive each of these components, that communication, compliance, climate, culture, and collaboration, in providing quality feedback that grows us towards those department goals? And one of the reasons that we had that Mentimeter is sometimes as a leader, you have to constantly be evaluating yourself and determining, what are my approaches when I'm out in front of my team members? How do my team members perceive me? I know that when I stepped into more of a leadership role by title, I don't think I recognized early on that leadership doesn't have to be a title. But as I stepped into that and more people started perceiving me as leader based on my title, I thought you could just tell people to do things and they would do it and they would be responsive. And boy, did I learn quickly that that's not the case. And so I had to really evaluate what it was that I was doing. And I think what really prompted that was just having guidance to get that feedback, to send that out to my teams. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll actually see some of my feedback. And I owe Sarah Marsh an apology because you cannot see it. And Sarah swore up and down you would not be able to see it. But that last one that is in the square there really hit home. It was someone giving me feedback. I don't know who this person is because it's all anonymous, that I tend to, as of last year, with this particular person, give too much of my opinion or solve too many problems versus asking those reflective questions. And so, although I don't know who this person is, my practice going into this year is to really focus on just being quiet, listening, and then responding more with reflective questions. And so I try to apply it to everyone in the team or on the team. And that's the thing that's unique to feedback, is it's so individualized. And it's really predicated on your relationship with each of your team members. And so whoever this is, it's good advice to apply to all, but ultimately it's something that is embedded in my relationship with this individual. And if that ever comes to light, that would be great. If they come out and say, that was me who wrote that, and they give me that candor that is up front. But it's a practice I want to apply to all, just in case I am interacting with that person. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give you guys a template to be able to send out feedback that you can get from your site members. And so the point of the last slide was for you to start to think of questions that you might ask in each of those particular C's, or in the C that you rated yourself lowest and that you perceive your team rated you lowest in. And we're going to kind of organize that activity through your student services contact. So they're going to be following up to share that template with you and then walk through that. And based on the feedback that we receive from each of you, we'll make sure that we finalize the templates, so that we can get that out sometime by the end of second or first semester. And we'll revisit that once we get that feedback and what that means to you. So you guys should look for that communication shortly this week after the lead meeting. right. Thank you, guys.
Righty. So to close out, we're going to go back to our learning intentions. We reviewed the importance of feedback and how it contributes to that collective teacher efficacy. We learned about some tools, about 7 keys to the effective feedback, and the importance of balancing that empathy and that candor, right? And how our department, our providing direct feedback, supports our work with the 4 Cs. We learned that feedback is what it is and what it's not, and how that our work doesn't stop here. It's how we deliver the neutral feedback and what's the common language that we're going to be using at our sites to help support everyone. And then we're asking you to participate in the process in gathering feedback and information from your peers and reflecting and sharing your experiences and information when meeting with your student services rep in your next one-on-one meeting. So thank you again for all your hard work as leads and being vulnerable, showing yourselves. I know as we were going through this process, I was thinking about certain things and how I could improve my practices. So our next lead meeting date is a save the date. Just to please remember, October 25th is updates only. November 29th is when we're going to continue on with our next lead meeting as well. Being able to designate that is the designated PD session. And Natasha's popping in the chat the evaluation link for today's PD. You will be receiving a resource document with the recording and the information and slides like you normally do. But please, if you could please, before you leave, complete the professional development form before you leave and log off. And we want to thank you guys so much for being here today.